I'm Marty Wasserman, and I'm speaking with Aryeh Green. Mr. Green is an American-born Israeli and a senior advisor to Natan Sharansky. You might remember Sharansky as the long-time Russian dissident who spent 9 years in the Soviet gulag. He was eventually allowed to emigrate to Israel, and since then he's become one of Israel's most important leaders. Mr. Green is visiting the U.S. partly to promote Sharansky's ideas about the role of democracy and human rights in Middle East politics. Mr. Green is also the director of an organization called Media Central, which provides support services to foreign journalists in Israel. Aryeh, pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks very much, Marty.
Let's talk a little bit about your relationship with Natan Sharansky. How long have you been working with him?
Well, I've known Mr. Sharansky for some 15 years or so. I started working with him informally as a member of his party, Israel Ba'aliyah. And then I became more and more involved with that. I helped to write the party platform in the late 90s, and I actually started working in the executive staff of the party.
And what was the party that was mostly representing the non-special Jews?
Well, that's when I came on board. My role in the executive staff of the party was to expand the parameters of the electorate that were interested in Israel Ba'aliyah in our platform, in the policies that we were promoting, and so we expanded into both Hebrew-speaking Israelis as well as English-speaking, French-speaking, and the like. And then after that, Mr. Sharansky invited me to join his staff in the Prime Minister's office, where we worked until he resigned his cabinet post in the middle of 2005.
Now, what sort of things do you advise him about? Do you advise him on the whole range of his activities, or is there some specific subset that you're involved with?
Well, Mr. Sharansky obviously has been involved in a number of different areas and fields of interest in different cabinet posts, as well as in terms of his own personal interests and as a thought leader. My role in the Prime Minister's office was primarily divided really into two. I was involved with a team that was working to combat the scourge of global anti-Semitism and the new anti-Semitism, the attacks on Israel and delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish state. And I took responsibility specifically for working with young Jewish leaders around the world, and also explicitly in focusing on the campuses and the university environments, faculty, students, and the like. I also had the privilege of being responsible for a project focused on helping to find practical ways to promote Palestinian independent democratic activists as well, and developed connections with different Arab civil society organizations and democracy activists throughout the region.
One of the big issues now is the question of whether democracy can take hold in Arab countries. Sharansky wrote a book called The Case for Democracy, very well-known book. The major idea was that if tyrannical governments could be replaced by democratic governments, they'd be less likely to start wars with their neighbors. And Sharansky was invited to the White House, and George Bush heaped lavish praise on him and said he was his soulmate.
That's right.
But the question is, can you really impose democracy on cultures that consider it something foreign and alien to themselves?
Well, honestly, I'd like to turn your question on its head. You use the word replace regimes which are tyrannical with democracy regimes, and you use the word impose. I don't think Mr. Sharansky is calling for advocating the replacement, i.e. from an outside source, nor the imposition. What the entire thrust of his argument, which, as you know, is based on Andrei Sakharov's statement, which is relatively well known, that democracies don't make war with other democracies, is to promote the emergence of democratic leaders, of democratic principles from within a society. So that's where we get to the answer to your question, the end part of your question, where you presume or you suggest that perhaps the Muslim nations of the world, people of the world, or Arab countries are not capable of being democratic. And that's something that Mr. Sharansky is vehement in opposing as an attitude. There are those, Bernard Lewis, the foremost scholar of, Professor Bernard Lewis from Princeton, scholar of the Islamic world and Islamic history, has shown in a number of different articles and books that there is a tradition of consensual decision-making within Islamic thought. There are countries today, Turkey is the prime example, but others also like Azerbaijan and others as emerging democracies who are showing that Muslim communities and the Muslim world can be democratic and move towards the creation of a more free society.
Well, what's your working definition of democracy? Is the fact of having elections to keep that? Iran has elections, Egypt has elections. A lot of countries have elections. The Palestinian Authority just elected Hamas.
It's very true, and in fact, that is probably the crux of the difficulty with the modern interpretation, if you will, over the last year or two of this issue of promoting democracy. Because democracy, as you say, is a structure which reflects, if you will, the will of the people, but a system which holds elections, which is not based on a democratic value system, which is to say a free society, is not by any definition a true democracy. So whether an election is held in Egypt or in the Palestinian Authority or even in a relatively moderate and a more developed democracy like Jordan, it's not a democracy at base. And in fact, Mr. Sharansky's, I suppose, harshest criticism of President Bush, which he expressed in a recent, maybe half a year ago, editorial in op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, was saying precisely that elections do not a democracy make, and what we have to focus on, all of us, the Western world, the free world, America, Israel, and anybody else who cares enough about this path towards stability, is to focus on supporting the dissident forces, the forces of democracy, the free liberal Democrats working to create within their own society, Palestinian or Egyptian or others, the foundation for a free society which will, if you will, guard the rights and the freedoms that we consider part and parcel of a democracy.
Now, it seems to me that a lot of tyrannical regimes are mostly concerned about self-interest. They're not interested in serving the people. They want to hold power as long as they can for purely selfish reasons. Now, what's motivating the person who wants democracy? Is he not motivated primarily by self-interest, or is he really thinking first and foremost of the entire population?
Well, I think the question is how we define self-interest. I think any leader of any country, in a democracy as well, is interested in promoting themselves. The difference, and Sharansky makes this point very powerfully in his book, the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship and an authoritarian regime is that while both leaders in both systems want to retain power, want to remain in their position of leadership, in a dictatorship that power is held and is furthered through the control that leader has over his people. Whereas in a democracy, the leadership that a democratic leader has is only held as long as he's providing benefits for his people.
You have to have some kind of preset cultural conditions in order to establish democracy. For example, a culture in which people generally agree that they'll solve their differences peacefully, as opposed to a society driven by centuries-old blood feuds.
Well, first of all, I think it's very important not to generalize neither about Muslims nor about Christian society, Jewish or any other. And in fact, I can connect this question with your last question, which is to say that the people, the democracy activists that I know in Palestinian society, in Egypt, from Jordan, Lebanon, or other Arab Middle East nations, are very concerned about the welfare of their society. And one of their primary concerns is the acceptance of the use of violence as a legitimate form of either political expression or conflict resolution. And there's no question, for instance, my very good friend Walid Salem from the Panorama Center in Jerusalem, and Riyad Malki, the head of the Panorama Center in Ramallah. Panorama Center is one of the leading civil society organizations in Palestinian society, run workshops constantly throughout Palestinian society on the issue of the use of more conciliatory forms of conflict resolution and the inadmissibility, if you will, of the use of violence in domestic disputes, in village disputes, and obviously then leading on from the same principle in national disputes. And there's no question that within the effort to bring greater freedoms and greater democracy is also an effort and a concern to create a more civil society, which is where the term comes from, which then can lead to a more peaceful resolution of the conflict with Israel.
But can they build up the peaceful society faster than the jihadists can tear it down?
Well, I think this is probably one of the crucial aspects of the effort to promote more freedom in the Middle East and anywhere else. There is no question when we look back at the development of, using Palestinian society as a microcosm and a very good example, a paradigm, if you will, of the ability of a society to develop in one direction and then move into another direction. Until 1993, it may surprise you to know, it certainly may surprise our viewing audience to know, that until 1993, the Palestinians as a society were the most educated, the most Westernly oriented, the freest society, as rated by objective standards, not Israel.
Is that because Israel was supporting those features?
Without question. And this is not, I'm not making this argument to justify Israeli administration of the disputed territories. That's a different issue, and reasonable people can disagree as to whether or not Israel should hold those territories, relinquish those territories, or the like. Facts, though, speak for themselves. And if you look at the United Nations, not the greatest friend of Israel, as I think we know, therefore we can't accuse them as being trying to distort the record in Israel's favor. Look at the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, statistics about infant mortality rates plummeting between 1967 and 1993 in terms of the public health service, and life expectancy rates growing, the gross domestic product of Palestinian society just taking off. The establishment, in fact, of 5 universities in the territories between 1967 and 1993. The point I'm making is those are statistics, but the wider context is to say that within the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as antagonistic as it may have been, as much as the Palestinians wanted, and still want, of course, today, their autonomy or their independence, Palestinians who are working towards a freer society for themselves are the first to recognize that the Palestinian freedoms that they enjoyed under Israeli rule, and that they learned from daily interaction with Israeli society, a robust democracy where civil debate and public debate on policies and respect for minorities' rights and the like were obviously a part of the course, helped to create a Palestinian society which was ripe to be the first democracy in the Arab Muslim Middle East. And this is, sorry.
But didn't the Palestinians lose a lot of those gains as soon as they became self-governing?
So that's exactly the point that we're leading to. The issue of the education, of the impact of the leadership and their control of the media and the educational system. That when Yasser Arafat and his cronies were parachuted in from Tunisia to set up what was effectively an authoritarian regime, a dictatorial regime for the Palestinians, they set about systematically tearing down all of the elements that had been slowly built up under Israeli administration, which were the founding elements of a real civil society and the beginnings of what should have become the first Arab Muslim democracy. Whether it was the very strong middle class in Palestinian society, whether it was a very free press. If you look at Freedom House, freedomhouse.org, which rates countries around the world, before 1993, the Palestinian territories were rated as the most free society in the Arab Muslim world in terms of civil rights, political rights, women's rights, freedom of the press, and the like, when it was under Israeli rule. Now, what's surprising, in fact, is that even though, and we helped, by the way, we the Israelis and we the Americans helped to set up an authoritarian regime for the Palestinians, which was a tremendous disservice to the Palestinian society as a whole. But even under Yasser Arafat, and since Mahmoud Abbas took over, Palestinian, for instance, journalists, while repressed and certainly not free, the Palestinian media is probably more free than almost any other Arab Muslim society. There are more daily, weekly, and monthly publications in Palestinian society than there are in many Arab and Muslim nations, with 20, 50 times the population. This, I think, still remains. This is where my optimism comes from in terms of the future. This remains probably the strongest foundation and the most important element looking towards the future of the ability of the Palestinians to throw off the mantle of this authoritarian regime that was set up and to create from within a real free society which can lead to the creation of a real democracy.
Now, where does Islam figure into this? You have the Islamists who are willing to die to destroy Israel. They're willing to give their lives. For the pro-democracy people willing to give their lives to establish democracy, and if they're not, how can they hope to defeat the jihadists?
Well, first of all, I don't pretend to be a scholar of Islam or of Muslim history, but I will say the very courageous activists that I know within Palestinian society and in other Arab countries are certainly willing to make great sacrifices for their ideals. You think of Saad ibn Ibrahim, the Egyptian sociology professor who was thrown into prison by Hosni Mubarak for 3 years for criticizing the regime in Egypt. And there are other, obviously, numerous examples, including in Palestinian society. Are they willing to lay down their lives? I think the issue is that we have to be willing, as we were under Ronald Reagan and Henry Scroop Jackson, in defense of dissidents like Natan Sharansky in the Soviet Union, that we in the free world have to be willing to make it very clear to the authoritarian regimes throughout the world, but certainly in the Middle East and in Palestinian society, that we will not allow these dissident voices of independent Democrats to be silenced, that we will not allow these individuals to be persecuted. And I do believe that they have just as much commitment to their ideals of building a free society which respects the rights of its citizens, no less than Natan Sharansky, Andrei Sakharov, and others.
Now, how much influence do these people have? For example, the United States is supporting Mahmoud Abbas, favoring him over Hamas. Is Abbas one of the people who you regard to be in the Democratic camp, who is working for civil society, Yasser Arafat's sidekick for 4 decades?
Well, you answered your own question, I think, or at least I agree with the way that you formulated the question. No, Mahmoud Abbas is not a Democrat. Mahmoud Abbas is not, as far as, from my perspective, a moderate. Mahmoud Abbas is the inheritor of a system and a regime which is still strongly authoritarian. He doesn't have the same cachet, doesn't have the same ability as a symbol of the Palestinian people to be quite as oppressive to his own people as Yasser Arafat was, but nevertheless, he is ruling over a system which carries out the same anti-Semitic incitement in its media, in the educational system, and the like. And when I say anti-Semitism, I do make a distinction. I'm talking about the traditional anti-Semitism, which calls for the death of Jews, which is rampant in Palestinian society and the media, and also Mahmoud Abbas is presiding over an educational system and a cultural system and a television broadcasting system which delegitimizes Israel. I don't know if you know, but if you look at every textbook in the Palestinian education system from K through 12, there is not a single map which lists the name of Israel on it. Every map says that the entirety of the land, not just the territories that were taken over by Israel after 1967, the entirety is Palestine.
I've heard also that school children of every age in the Palestinian territories are taught that the noblest aspiration they could possibly have is to become a suicide bomber and kill themselves while taking as many Jews as possible with them.
Well, here also, I think it's very important to distinguish between, not to generalize, there's no question that there is what I term, and it offends my Palestinian friends, a culture of hatred in Palestinian society. The answer to what you asked before about whether or not there is any ability to win against the jihadists, I think comes from an understanding of where that hatred comes from. If and when Mahmoud Abbas and or others who replace him and or our friends who are the democracy activists insist that the newspapers and the other media and the television, the educational system, the cultural milieu where sports events are named after suicide martyrs, change their focus, both in terms of a focus on the benefits that can be created for Palestinian society instead of a focus on destroying Israel, and a focus on peace and toleration and compromise rather than a focus on jihad and war and destruction, then I think we're going to see a much different society. But that is an educational and cultural issue.
The question is, these moderates have enough guns to make that stick. It seems like very much the Palestinian Authority, guns are the supreme voice.
But
who
isn't
has
that
the most guns, and that seems to be getting more so, not less.
But isn't that a contradiction in term? Of course, we don't see, and the moderates themselves don't see themselves as needing guns to achieve their ends. The opposite. If our moderates, our meaning all of us who are within, let's call it the moderate democracy camp, feel that the only way to achieve the goals that we're all pursuing is through the force of arms, then almost by definition we're contradicting our primary principles. All of the democracy activists and civil society organizations that I'm familiar with insist that through a process of educating youth and the adults, through a process of negotiation and compromise and commitment to the principles we're talking about, they will eventually be able to transform the society, Palestinian society or Ukrainian society or Lebanese society, from within, and not through the barrel of a gun.
Now, is it possible that some conflicts just cannot be resolved peacefully? Sooner or later, some battles have to be fought. I've heard a lot of Muslim leaders in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere say that they're looking forward to one of two possibilities: victory over Israel or death by martyrdom, and they don't particularly care which one they get. So it's hard to see how you're going to persuade them to change.
Let's accept, as I said before in response to your first question, you said how I'm going to persuade them. I'm not on a campaign to persuade the Palestinians to change their government. I'm on a campaign, as it were, to help those Palestinians who would like to see change within their own society to be able to be as successful as possible. Will they be able to be successful? That depends a lot on how we in the free world, all of us, for our own reasons as well as our concern for their welfare, support them and enable them to be more successful. The issue is not whether or not I'm going to be able to change them. The issue is whether or not they're going to be able to have the impact in their own society that Sakharov and Sharansky had in the Soviet Union, that the Ukrainian masses had when they camped out in the Orange Revolution, whether they're going to be able to have the impact like even the Lebanese people had in getting Syria out of their country. I think we've seen over the last number of years the ability of people within a society to demand change from their leadership. One of the crucial issues is whether or not there is going to be the creation of a critical mass in Palestinian society to bring that about. I think there is.
Let's talk a little bit about human rights, because that's something else that you and Sharansky are promoting. Everybody talks about human rights, but the definition seems a little unclear. What is your view on, what are the basic rights that every person is entitled to just because they're a human being?
Well, the funny thing is the title of my talk, most of the talks that I've given in the last few years on behalf of Mr. Sharansky and also independently, including those here that I'm giving in the Bay Area, is precisely that: human rights and freedom in the Middle East, human rights and democracy in the Middle East. And the purpose or the focus of my talk, leading off from the argument Mr. Sharansky has been making for over a decade, is that the concept of human rights has been hijacked, as it were. Where once Mr. Sharansky understood almost implicitly, without a lot of academic research into the matter, but from his own experience in the Soviet prison system, that fundamentally human rights have to be defined as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, women's rights, gay rights, even freedom of expression, freedom of religion. In the last few decades, there's been a move toward some co-opting of the term human rights as to apply to, for instance, the right, quote-unquote, of the Palestinians to an independent state. Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I do have a master's in international relations.
The right to personally check them without being checked.
So that's what we're getting to. My understanding of international humanitarian law is that there is not, nowhere enshrined, not in the UN Charter or elsewhere, a right to an independent state for any community that defines itself as separate. If there were, I would imagine the Kurds would be the first to be granted that right. The Tibetans, the Basques, and others, and the Palestinians would be in line at some point. And for the record, for years now, since I think 1989, when I wrote an article first advocating a Palestinian state, I'm in favor of the establishment of a Palestinian state, irrespective of historical issues, whether or not they were or weren't an independent people as of 100 or even 50 years ago. The issue, though, and I think this is the fundamental issue, of those who advocate that there are human rights issues related to Israel's administration of the territories, it's not... Let's come back to your issue of checkpoints and roadblocks. There's no question that there are activities that are carried out in an effort to combat the terrorist attacks that have been plaguing Israel and carried out by the Palestinian extremist terrorist groups over the last decade that infringe in one aspect or another on Palestinian rights. And there is, whether you call that an infringement of rights or whether you call that a necessary mechanism to fight terror, is not the point here. Even if we accept that restrictions on freedom of movement are an infringement on Palestinian rights, we have to ask ourselves, how do we relate to that infringement? There is a question of historical context. There is a question of the reality within which these infringements are carried out. And I'll give you one example.
Does a person who doesn't like me have a right to carry a gun in my presence?
Well, you know what? I'd like, if you don't mind, to give a more specific example. All of us in America and around the world are now very used to going through the security apparatus when we check in for an airplane. And we're asked very specific questions. Where did you come from? Who packed your bag? Have your bags been with you this whole time? And then we get in line and we put our bags through the x-ray, and sometimes some of us, whether we're a 97-year-old grandmother or a 15-year-old teenager, are pulled out of line for a spot check and our suitcase is open. Now this is a tremendous infringement on our privacy. Our fundamental right to privacy. We in America have laws against illegal and unwarranted search and seizure. We normally don't allow the authorities to open a suitcase and rifle through our possessions. But we do allow it. And why do we allow it? Why do we accept it as people, and why does our legal system allow that kind of fundamental breach of our right to privacy?
Because it's a trade-off, because we're making ourselves more secure by leaving out people who might try to kill us all.
Precisely. Or to put it another way, we are balancing our fundamental right to life with against other rights, which are also fundamental, but when we balance them, the right to life and the preservation and protection of life does take precedence over a number of other rights. So then we understand why, for instance, in France, in the riots of last year, there were 2,000 administrative detentions of different rioters, most of whom were young Middle Eastern men, and yet the international community, media, political or otherwise, were not up in arms castigating France as the grossest violator of human rights in the world.
I guess to clarify, an administrative detention is a detention where you're arrested with no charges against you and locked up.
No habeas corpus or
choose to keep you locked up.
What have you. Correct. My point is that it would have been laughable for the United Nations Human Rights Commission or American progressive activists to condemn France as the grossest violator of human rights in the world because of its use of temporary and severe measures to quell the rioting in France. There's no question that there is legitimate criticism to be made of America for building a security fence between America and Mexico, of France for different activities carried out in the times of those riots, and of course of Israel in different policies it pursues in its fight against Palestinian terror. The issue, the fundamental issue is reasonable people can argue over specific policies that Israel may pursue, whether they're fair, whether they're effective, whether they're even, let's say, within the context of international law. But when we have 300,000, 400,000 people being murdered and raped and kicked out of their homes in Darfur, it is unconscionable that the international activists in human rights issues will declare that Israel is the grossest violator of human rights for building a security barrier, for demolishing the homes of terrorists, or for setting up checkpoints and roadblocks where people can freely pass through as long as they are not carrying contraband or weapons of terror, to suggest that Israel, on a scale, is as bad or worse than the atrocities being carried out in Darfur is really getting to the crux of the issue, the definition of what we mean when we talk about human rights.
Well, doesn't the right to protect yourself against threat take precedence over adhering to theories of the way things ought to be? When a person feels threatened, yes, I believe in free speech in theory. However, if I feel sufficiently threatened by somebody's free speech, I might not just stand still and honor his right to say what he likes about me.
Well, I don't think it's a question of feelings, Oliver Wendell Holmes, of course, in his famous statement that free speech does not give you the right to yell fire in a crowded theater, is part of, I think, this discussion we're having. Fundamental human rights have to be respected, but there is a balance, there is a continuum on which those rights exist. And as I think we've agreed, the right to life, and therefore the responsibility of the authorities to preserve life, to protect people's lives, does take precedence over certain other rights. And that is a tension. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court, which is one of the most activist Supreme Courts in the world, in fact, Chief Justice Rehnquist, in a meeting with former Chief Justice Barak from the Israeli Supreme Court, said, and is on record as saying that America could learn from the Israeli Supreme Court and their very active role in ensuring the protection of civil rights, political rights, and human rights, both in Israel and in our activities in the territory.
That's created a lot of controversy because
tremendous amount of controversy.
They have tilted too much in favor of the Palestinians against themselves. So the question is Israel as a Jewish state obliged to protect Jews as its first mission, or does it place the well-being of people who are essentially its enemies on an equal level with its own people?
Well, I think that's what I was starting to say, is that the Supreme Court, as an example, has been very active in protecting the different sorts of issues on behalf of the Palestinians. And there are times when the security barrier that we've been building has been rerouted even after it's been built at the cost of hundreds of millions of shekels, because an appeal was made and a decision was taken that in this balance, in this precarious balance between the need to protect our civilians, which of course, by the way, are not only Jewish but are Muslim and Christian as well as visitors, of course, in Israel, the balance between the need to protect the civilian population in Israel and yet the need to also promote and defend the basic quality of life of the Palestinians. In that balance, we, I think, have struck a tremendously faithful balance. I don't think, by the way, yes, there are those who feel, and I do feel that our Supreme Court is more active, perhaps, than it might otherwise be. On the other hand, I'm very proud to be part of a society where we do strike that balance, continually fight, struggle to achieve that balance, and I'm proud of the balance that we've managed to achieve.
But Israel doesn't seem to get much international credit for bending over backwards to protect the interests of the Palestinians. After the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel had nothing but praise. The anti-Semites were largely silenced. They used force, they used it quickly and effectively and won. And the world admired that. But now whenever they say we have to make painful compromises, we have to concern ourselves with the well-being of the people on the other side, they seem to get less respect. Is there something wrong with that? Is it like lack of respect goes with perception of weakness, for example?
That could be true. It could be true, and I don't consider myself a student of social psychology or issues in terms of the perceptions of the public. There's no question that whether it's the media or political leaders or the academic world, there has been a change in attitude towards Israel over the last number of decades. Whether that's a result of Israel's seeming weakness, or whether it's a result of other forces, maybe we can talk about later. But I will say this. The way that the world perceives Israel, I think, is as much a function of the lens that they're looking at Israel and the picture of Israel that's presented to them by the media, by political leaders and the like. A tremendous example of this, and I don't pretend to know the why, I'm only talking about the what, was what happened in Jenin in 2002. I'm sure you're familiar.
An alleged massacre that never occurred.
Right. Your viewers may be familiar with this story of a supposed massacre that the media, the world's media, including American media, reported as fact on the basis of a number of statements by Palestinian leaders, suggesting that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians that were killed, and most particularly innocent Palestinian civilians. Now, I don't want to take too much of our time to go into the details of the Battle of Jenin, but what is important in terms of this discussion is an understanding that not only there wasn't a massacre, which is an issue that we're not here to talk about the media and how willing they were to report that story, but the fact that there were 52 people who were killed in the Battle of Jenin in 2002. There's a slight discrepancy between the Israeli figures, who suggest that 50 of those 52 were armed combatants, and the United Nations figures, who suggest that 48 of those 52 were armed combatants. But there's no question that the consensus, acknowledged by, in the end, most of the world's media who reported the story as a massacre, that most of the combatants, that most of the dead from the Palestinian side in the Battle of Jenin were armed combatants, members of either Islamic Jihad or Hamas or other terrorist groups. What's fundamentally missed, I think, to this day, within public opinion, political leadership, certainly within the media, is the importance of the reasons that the Israeli soldiers, the 23 Israeli soldiers who died in the Battle of Jenin, why did they die? And the answer here, I think, goes to the base of our conversation about what really are human rights. The Israeli army went into Jenin in order to rout, to find, to take out the hotbed of terrorism and the terrorists and the terrorist leaders that were headquartered there in the small 4-block area of the refugee camp, about a 12,000 person refugee camp in the larger city of Jenin, which has about 65,000 citizens. It's important to know that 75%, 3/4 of the suicide bombers that had attacked Israel in the previous 2 to 3 years had come from that 4-block square area within the refugee camp in Jenin. The Palestinian Authority, according to its signed commitments, was meant to and had committed to control, disarm, and dismantle the terrorist groups that we're talking about. And in fact, for at least a year or 2 years leading up to Israel's decision that it had to go in and take out these terrorists if the Palestinian Authority wasn't, this was a no-go area for the Palestinian police. We went into this area, and here's where it gets interesting as far as human rights is concerned. And I'm elaborating slightly because I think that this is a fundamental example to understand what we mean when we talk about human rights.
That Israel refrained from bombing their targets from the air because they might kill civilians, and so they sent in troops on the ground, which resulted in greater Israeli casualties.
That's precisely the point.
Now, is that a concern for human rights? You know, there's a concept in Judaism that whoever is compassionate to the cruel will end up being cruel to the compassionate. In the Palestinian areas, for every fighter who's out there wielding a gun, there's a whole infrastructure of people behind him to give him the means he needs to be able to carry that gun. And they all wear civilian clothes. So even if not everyone who was killed was carrying a gun, he was likely part of the support structure that enabled the gun carriers.
That might be true, but you know what? That's almost not the point, because there were so few within the context of the Palestinians who were killed in that particular battle. But that's almost irrelevant. What is relevant is precisely what you said about the reason that these Israeli soldiers were killed. We could have gone in with air power, artillery, or bombs dropped from planes, as NATO did in Bosnia, as America did in Afghanistan, as American Britain did in Iraq. Standard operating procedure for free societies fighting war is to protect our soldiers first. We didn't do that. We talk about Israel as a Jewish state based on a fundamental Jewish value of a reverence for life. Not only didn't we do that in the beginning of the battle, but halfway through the battle, the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces came to the cabinet and requested permission to use aerial power. And that permission was denied because of the relatively high estimates of potential civilian casualties. And therefore, even though it's very painful to say this, I believe fundamentally that the reason that our soldiers died in Jenin was not to protect Israel. It was not to protect the Israeli people. My son now serves in the army. I've served in the army for 17 years in reserve duty. The reason that we are willing to to sacrifice ourselves and our children is to protect our country and to protect our people. The fact that our soldiers died to protect the innocent men, women, and children in the Jenin refugee camp comes to... No, I'm sorry. Here I'll disagree with you. Okay. It's very important to recognize, of course, there are innocent, both women and children and men, in the Jenin refugee camp. One of the tragedies of this situation in the last 60 years has been the fact that the Palestinian society are pawns in the games played and the animosity created and the hatred of Israel and the rejection of the existence of Israel on the part of their leaders. But the average Palestinian men, women, and children who are not part of a terrorist entity are, without question, civilians and innocent. My point is, we sacrificed our boys to protect the innocent civilians, the women and children and men in that camp. And that stands, whether you agree, as you question, whether or not that's the right policy to pursue, whether in the future we should be more protective of our soldiers as America and Britain and other free societies are in prosecuting war. The point is that we can be proud as Jews, proud as Israelis, of the fact that those are the values that are informing the operational decisions that we take in the midst of a war against terrorists who are bent on our destruction.
Let's go on to something else here. I'd like to spend some time talking about media coverage of Israel. Israel gets very bad media coverage. You pick up any newspaper, the headline is Palestinian killed by Israelis. When you get to the bottom, you see that he was an armed terrorist launching an attack. They seem to bend over backwards to give the Arabs the benefit of the doubt, to deny it to Jews. Now, on one hand, Jews are reputed to control the media in some quarters. On the other hand, they get really bad press. Now, why is that?
Well, this relates to two different things. First of all, we know Jews don't control the media, and that's a canard which anti-Semites have used now, unfortunately, for many years to impute, even though we know there is a lack of balance to Israel's detriment, to suggest that there's in fact a lack of balance in Israel's favor, which is somewhat ironic. I don't really want to focus on the why, again, on why it is that the media seems so biased against Israel.
It does seem, factually, it does seem to lean against.
For those of us who know and are aware of the accurate picture of what goes on in the Middle East, of what goes on in Israel and its relations with the Palestinians, with its own minorities, Israel as a country, and the historical context of the conflict, there's no question that many media outlets seem to have or seem to view this conflict through a particular lens outside of which they seem to be unable to function. And that lens is, of course, the acceptance of the Palestinian narrative of an indigenous people that were colonized by these Jews who came from Europe out of nowhere and took their land as if there was a Palestinian independent entity that was occupied by the Israelis, whether it's 1948 or 1967. The acceptance of the Palestinian narrative as an oppressed people living in an occupied land is one that, yes, I think we have to acknowledge as objective observers. And I do, what is objectivity? Of course I'm pro-Israel. I'm a Zionist. I'm in favor of the establishment and the legitimacy of a Jewish state of Israel for all the historical and moral and legal and political reasons that I think the majority of Americans also are.
But isn't it the job of the media to distinguish between truth and falsehood? If they examine the narrative and they determine that it's simply false, shouldn't they present that? Or maybe they're convinced that it's true, or maybe they feel they have something to gain by playing along, even if they don't think it's true.
What I want to say about the media is this. Most of the media, to generalize, most journalists, whether they're based in Israel or elsewhere around the world, I think are professionals looking to report and to reflect an accurate picture of wherever they're reporting from. But what happens? All of us are affected by what we've learned, what we already know about a particular situation, our experiences in looking into those stories. Whether you're a tourist or a journalist, you are affected by the experiences that you have with a rude Frenchman in Paris, or a rude Israeli in Jerusalem, or a welcoming and embracing Palestinian fixer, as it were, who works with journalists to find and provide different services. We are all affected by the relationships that we develop and by the educational opportunities we've had to learn more about the situation. What I found, and this I think comes to this is one of the reasons why I've decided to head up this project called Media Central in Jerusalem. I think that the caliber of journalists who are serving today, who are posted today and work in Israel and the territories and the region, is much different than the caliber of journalists that were there, say, 15 years ago. The vast majority of the journalists who are serving in Israel and the territories today are professionals. They are interested in the accurate story. They don't come as anti-Semites or full of anti-Israel attitudes. Yes, they do come having accepted to a certain extent the common wisdom that's been accepted over the past 30 years of the Palestinian narrative, but that doesn't mean they're locked into that. And that's one of the reasons why we've begun to have some effect and been able to be successful in developing relationships with the media who are now based in Israel, because they're interested in different aspects of the story.
One of the criticism that's sometimes made of Israel is that they don't do a good job of making their own case. They're constantly accused of things by the Palestinians, and the Israelis don't seem to know how to respond to that. So if the Palestinians say, this is our land, every inch of it belongs to us, and the Israelis say, well, we're willing to share it, I mean, what is the public going to think about who really is tied to that land?
Well, just to take that example, I have to agree that every time that I speak in a public forum, and every time that I've written over the last 20 years, having lived in Israel for 22 years, every time that I speak about my willingness to accept the legitimacy of a Palestinian interest or claim or demand for autonomy or independence or a state, I always preface that with a statement that it's important for us, my listeners, our viewers, others that are involved in this dialogue, to recognize that the Jewish people have a legitimate, historical, not only religious, but legal claim to all of the land of Israel, including the administered territories, a claim that's at least as strong from a legal or historical standpoint as the Palestinians. And therefore, you're correct that if that's not mentioned, if that's not seen as a concession, if it's not seen as a step towards peace and accommodation on the part of the Israelis, when we say, yes, we're willing to countenance and even to work towards, as we did throughout the Oslo process, to the establishment of an independent Palestinian entity, you're right, it does us a disservice. But coming back to the media, the issue here, I think, is that the acceptance of, for instance, the word occupation, as if that's a given, is something that at this point, I don't think that we can combat that. We can't fight that. There are certain things that after 30 years of usage, we're beating our heads against the windmill. And therefore, Israel's activities today have to be focused on showing an accurate picture of Israel and the context of the conflict and the like, which then can help to put into a more realistic framework all of the different issues that the journalists are reporting.
Well, I've heard many high-level Israeli politicians publicly say that they consider this to be an occupation of somebody else's land, necessitated by the fact that there's a threat coming from that land, but nevertheless, they're saying the land rightfully belongs to the Arabs, not the Jews. So the Arabs say, well, then let us have all the land because it all belongs to us.
Well, let's admit that in any democratic society, America, Europe, Israel, or other, there will be people on the street, in the Houses of Parliament or Congress, and or on the media, who will express opinions that may be either unfounded or not well-founded. That is the nature of any democracy, and Israel's no different. So therefore, of course, there are Israeli leaders who accept the Palestinian narrative for whatever reasons, psychological, historical, or the like. I think what's important here is to look at what is the objective reality. And the objective reality, to go back to our example of this claim of the Palestinians, the objective reality is that there was something called a Palestinian orchestra, there was something called the Palestine Post, there was something called the Palestinian Brigade in the British Army. All of these were Jewish residents of Palestine who were identified as a Palestinian until 1948. The creation of an identity of the Palestinian people was a process which started in the mid-50s and consummated in the establishment in 1964 of the Palestine Liberation Organization, whose goal, 1964, before, of course, the 1967 liberation or occupation of the disputed territories, whose goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. The issue, however, of the identity of the Palestinians is no longer up for debate. Palestinian people exist as an identifiable cultural national entity, whether we like it or not, and their right to an independent state has been accepted by the vast majority of the world's people, including the vast majority of the Israeli people, not just right or left-wing fringes. Therefore, what is the story, therefore, that the media should be reporting and needs to be aware of? It's a story which relates to what are the fundamental components of that Palestinian national entity that need to be created. This goes back to our discussion of the freedoms that we talk about advocating as far as what are really the human rights of the Palestinians and who is really violating those rights. Palestinian Authority in repressing journalistic freedom or the like. And what is the reality of Israel within the context of its struggle for its survival, its creation of a robust democracy which does respect the rights of all of its citizens, including the 20% of its citizens which are mostly Muslim Arabs as well as some Christian Arabs. I think to a certain extent what we're talking about is how we frame, how we view, and how we frame the conflict and the history of the region.
It sounds like Israel is trying to cut some kind of fair deal, but the Arabs are holding out for total victory. They consider a conflict between two peoples. They're not interested in a deal. They want to win. They can gain advantage through propaganda. They can gain advantage through terrorism, drive Jews out. But they're very clear about what their goals are. They know what they want. Is Israel equally clear about what it wants?
I think so. And I think to a certain extent we have to also distinguish between Israel as a democratic society which expresses its opinions through an electoral process, as we talked about before, and the Palestinians or other Arab Muslims who are in fact not really able to express what they really want. You use the word they. I don't know who they is. I do know that the jihadists conform to your definition of what they really want, to drive Israel to the sea. To a certain extent, yes, and that's one of the issues now that's being resolved even as we speak, unfortunately through violence and hopefully through accommodation in the Palestinian society, and they're empowering Iran, and they're empowering Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and that is a frightening prospect. But there are many Palestinians and many Arabs and other Muslims who have a different goal, who aren't part of that same they. And there are many whose goal is to establish a liberal, democratic society within the Palestinian territories, which is interested in living side by side in peace with Israel. They may be the minority today, but in surveys done before the recent Palestinian elections, they were not in a minority. The majority of Palestinians accepted the basis of the Oslo Accord, which is an acceptance of the state of Israel. The real question is, what can we do to help those forces become more popular within Palestinian society so that at the next round of elections, Hamas, instead of getting a plurality and being able to form a government, perhaps will be displaced by not Fatah, an equally corrupt and, from my point of view, a terrorist-supporting, terrorist-encouraging part of Palestinian society. Will they both be replaced by independent liberal Democrats?
Is it possible that the way to help the moderates is to eliminate the jihadists?
It's very possible. And for the record, Mr. Sharansky, for instance, advocated in 2002 as part of Operation Defensive Shield, when we went in, not only to Jenin, but other parts of the territories, that the time had come to accept in 2002, after 9 years, that the Oslo experiment had failed, that it was time to help the Palestinians after a decisive military victory, as the Allies did in Germany after World War II and in Japan,
After Germany was defeated.
after a decisive military victory, to help the society create the mechanisms within which these issues, these messages, these values can be not imposed from outside, but help to develop from within. And that's one of the questions that I think we have today. We're not going to go in at this point in the immediate future, Israel, to the territories in order to gain that decisive military victory. We have to find other ways to help to encourage those elements to develop from within.